Good evening and welcome to the Planning Commission meeting of September 21st, 2022. We'll start with confirmation and roll call.
The agenda was posted in accordance with open meeting law. All members are present. Member Biaski and Member Bonner are via telephone.
Thank you. Would you all stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So we'll open this meeting with an initial public comment period. Comments during this portion of the agenda must be limited to matters on the agenda for action. Each person would have up to 5 minutes to speak. And let's open that. Would anyone in the audience care to be heard on the agenda item of tonight? Seeing no one rushing to the podium, I would open it up for our virtual audience. And if you have comments, please call in to 702-589-9629, and we'll give it a minute to accommodate the delay. Hearing no comments, we'll close the initial public comment period and move to, well, I guess I should ask, were there any comments? Madam Clerk, any comments?
No written comments were submitted.
Thank you. We'll move on to the first agenda item for possible action. That's approval of the minutes of the August 17th, 2022 regular meeting.
I'll move for approval.
Do we have a
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? All in favor. All right, let's move to the...
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, this is Ernie Biasi. I'm having difficulty hearing you. I don't know if it's just your mic, so if it's possible to speak up, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
All righty. Is that any better?
That's better. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so going to the second item, training and discussion on future ordinance amendments regarding tiny homes. And I think we're starting out with a presentation.
Good afternoon, Chairman Matuska, members of the Planning Commission. Michael Mays, your Community Development Director. So earlier this year, staff had engaged the Planning Commission on training opportunities. The Planning Commission had identified several areas that you wanted to focus on this year, and then we asked you to prioritize those in terms of importance. Tiny homes is the next in those training opportunities, and we prepared a presentation to explain, and we provide you background on tiny homes and the reason it's being considered by the Planning Commission and the community. So you're probably all familiar with what tiny homes look like. These are just a couple of different images of tiny homes. I will get into a definition here in a little bit. But basically, they are a permanent residence, smaller, much smaller than your average single-family home. And they typically have a living area, bathroom, and kitchen area, as well as a sleeping area. If you watch HGTV, there's several shows that promote and highlight tiny homes and how they're being used across the country. The reason why the Planning Commission wanted to have a workshop on this is because of legislation that came out of the 2021 Nevada legislative bills that were approved and signed by the governor, specifically Senate Bill 150. In Senate Bill 150, it requires counties and municipalities in the state of Nevada to implement regulations that will permit tiny homes in their jurisdictions. This has to be completed by January 1st of 2024. What the bill says, and we provided in the packet of information for you, is that jurisdictions have to do certain things. And what I want to emphasize here is that there are different requirements for communities over 150,000 in population as opposed to communities under 150,000 in population. You will have seen in the attached Senate Bill 150, it says that those communities that are larger than 150,000 must do all three of these things, which includes designate at least one zoning district that permits tiny homes as an accessory dwelling unit, allow in one zoning district tiny homes as a single family dwelling unit, and provide for tiny home parks, which would be similar to like a mobile home park. Because Boulder City is under 150,000, we're only required to have to implement one of these. So that's key. So what is the definition of a tiny home? What the International Building Code says is a tiny house is considered a dwelling unit 400 square feet or smaller, excluding lofts. So this is very much different than your typical dwelling unit like a single-family home. In the material that we provided, and I wanted to note that with the APA article from 7 years ago, and even to this day, there has been this discussion of are tiny homes RVs? And so that's why I wanted to provide the definition in your material and in the presentation of the definition of an RV. So this is from the Recreational Vehicle Industry Association. The key difference with an RV is it's intended to be a mobile unit. It's not intended to be permanently occupied. It is classified as a vehicle and regulated by the Department of Transportation's National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So with an RV, it's intended to be moved around, whereas a tiny home is intended for permanent occupancy. So what I wanted to do to kind of talk about the different aspects of this is kind of just summarize the three areas in the Senate bill and then get feedback from the Planning Commission on how to proceed with a potential text amendment. So let's start with single family or tiny home or house parks. Now, some options for Boulder City to consider. is inclusion of this as a permitted use in the R1 zoning districts, the RV zoning districts, but you've already heard why I think that that's not appropriate, to permit it in the existing mobile home districts as a permitted use, or to create an entirely new zoning district that just accommodates tiny homes. So from staff's recommendation, we would eliminate the R1s, and in part because we already have provisions in the zoning ordinance that talk about minimum sizes for single-family homes. For example, in the R17 zoning district, the minimum size of the home you can build is 1,000 square feet. So clearly, a tiny home is not going to meet that standard. And so you would have to consider how you would incorporate that into a zoning district that otherwise requires larger structures. And for the reason I explained before, it's meant for permanent occupancy, so we don't think it's appropriate in the RV zones. So one of the suggestions is to consider allowing it in the existing mobile home zoning districts. We include in the presentation the locations of those. We have mobile home estates and mobile home parks. Mobile home estates allow for the individual land subdivision of parcels to accommodate those mobile homes, where the estate is usually one single lot and the units are rented. And yes, Susan? Mobile home estates are single family. Mobile home estates are when they own their own lot. Yes. Yes. And parks are one parcel. Yes. That's what I thought I said, but anyway, estates, again, individual lots, and mobile home parks, singular lots. And so this is the location of those within the community. So we already have several areas of the community zoned for mobile home estate and mobile home parks. So, as an accessory use option, we wanted to provide an accessory dwelling definition. An accessory dwelling, an ADU, is a legal or regulatory term for a secondary house on a lot. So this can't be subdivided out. It is allowing for permanent occupancy in an ADU on a property that already allows for a single-family home. And as the Planning Commission knows, we do not permit that in our zoning code. If this was to be considered, then we'd have to take into consideration other regulations for accessory dwelling units. Some other terms for accessory dwelling units: casitas, granny flats, carriage houses, mother-in-law units. A consideration for the tiny homes is that they could be accommodated as an accessory dwelling unit in the R1 zoning districts or the R3 zoning districts, or another zoning district as determined by a recommendation from the Planning Commission to the City Council. And as I noted, it's important that if we are going to allow tiny homes as an accessory dwelling unit, then we have to consider other accessory dwelling units as well. And then taking into consideration what would be the setbacks for an accessory dwelling unit, what would be the parking requirements for that. So next steps in this process, as I noted at the beginning of the presentation, Boulder City has to accommodate, per Senate Bill 150, tiny homes by January 1st of 2024. And so with feedback from the Planning Commission, we would pursue preparing a draft text amendment. And as with any text amendment to Title 11, it would come back before the Planning Commission for a public hearing, for reviewing and a recommendation. And then it would go on to the City Council as a bill introduction. No action is taken at that initial meeting. It's just introduced. And then within 30 days, the City Council would consider that text amendment to Title 11. And so with that, I'll take any questions.
Is there a number that we have to allow for? Like, is there,
That was my question.
should I go through? Mr. Chairman, I have a question. Are we doing the Robert's rules?
Well, I think
Well,
during,
it's a workshop, so
here's
yeah,
the
yeah.
deal.
Oh, it's a workshop,
Yeah, yeah.
okay.
yeah, during the
So-
training, no, don't approve it.
Is there an allotment? So once this is taken in, are we, you have to have 100 spaces, or do you have to have 50 spaces, or do you have to have 5 spaces?
The bill didn't
we-
specify.
It didn't specify. So as long as there's accommodations somewhere for it to happen. Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Go ahead, Ms. Bonaire.
Hi, this is Beth. Looking back at the next steps timeline where there's a 30-day requirement before the council can vote on it after the introduction and the review, what is the latest that we can make a decision or a recommendation to get this done before the required deadline?
Well, just to
And
clarify, they don't have to wait 30 days. They have to consider it within 30 days of the bill introduction. And to answer your second question, obviously, we don't want to wait till the end of 2023 to be bringing this to the Planning Commission, the City Council. So ideally, we'd be working on this the middle of next year to be able to advance this forward and comply with the state law.
Thank you.
Other questions?
In the mobile home parks right now, is there a, excuse me, a minimum dwelling size right now? Is everything, would we have to change anything to do a minimum dwelling size for the mobile home park?
And that's a good question, because in the single-family zoning districts, they all have minimum requirements. In the mobile home estate zoning district, the ones where there are individual lots, there is a minimum requirement of 900 square feet. In the mobile home park zoning district, there is not. It doesn't mean, though, that with a text amendment, you could allow mobile homes with a minimum square footage and a tiny home at a different square footage. But if you didn't want to, have that type of conflict, then you would look at just accommodating it in the mobile home park zoning district where there is no minimum requirements.
So earlier, we talked about the RV park over on the other side of the golf course, and we're already gonna allow the tiny homes in there, correct?
If referring to Elite RV, those would not be tiny homes, because tiny homes are presumed to be permanent occupancy. What they're proposing are cabins, which would be like motel rooms.
Over
Still,
or under 400 square feet.
right, there's no minimum or maximum for those
Okay.
cabins, because they wouldn't be defined as a tiny home.
So if we, could we also, for the few RV parks that we have, allow tiny homes in there, or are they designated RV only, recreation vehicles?
That could certainly be something that is provided. We do have within the RV parks allowing for up to 2 permanent single-family dwellings. But I guess by my point earlier, since the primary intent of the RV zones is to accommodate RVs which are not permanently occupied and are regulated by the vehicle industry standards, and to then mix it with permanent structures, that would be a consideration.
So one last question, I don't mean to monopolize this, but once they come in as a mobile unit, rolled in, are they made into real property with a foundation at some point, like you do on a mobile home, where you remove the tires, put a foundation underneath it, and then it becomes permanent?
That would be
and
the
real
intent,
property?
yes.
That was, I kind of have the same type of question for clarification. This bill addresses permanent housing in a tiny home. It's not about tiny homes that people will move around. This is a permanent housing bill, correct?
Correct, and I understand that with the material that was provided to you, that was a question still being asked, and some people do use them as RVs and keep them on a permanent chassis and move them
Right.
around. But yes, the Senate bill is for permanent occupancy, so the intent would be to place it on a foundation. It would not be moved around.
So with that being said, aren't our RV, our mobile home parks privately owned?
The ones that are mobile home parks, yes. Yeah.
So, but they, if we change our zoning, we are telling them you have to allow tiny homes if we went that route.
That's up to them as to whether they would be willing to accommodate that on their property. We're just
So-
allowing the regulation through the zoning.
Okay, that was my other question. So if we create the zone, allowing it in the mobile home district, we have complied with the legislative mandate. Okay, got it.
Mr. Chairman, Michael, if we went the route with creating another zoning district somewhere else, obviously it'd have to go before the ballot for a land sale because there's no other area that that this new zoning district that we would create for tiny homes would currently exist. Would that satisfy the requirement of the Senate bill, just creating the zoning district
In
in
concept,
text?
I don't know the direct answer to that, but I suspect there may be some questions if communities throughout Nevada allow for it, but don't have a practical location for it within their communities. The intent
That's my
here is
point
to
would be it'd
accommodate
have to go
it.
to the ballot, and then the citizens would vote on it one way or the other. If they
Well-
voted it down, then citizens basically just told the state that we're gonna not comply.
Yeah, I think that presents problems. Now, technically, the city could lease land to an operator that could allow for a tiny home park somewhere within our community on city-owned land. And so that wouldn't require the ballot question. But I think part of the reason staff is recommending the mobile home park is that the tiny homes are very similar to mobile homes in terms of size, needs. The tiny home zoning districts have setback requirements that I think would fit well with tiny homes and would be easy to accommodate for electrical hookups for these types of dwelling units. And I guess more, also want to add, we've been talking to the other jurisdictions within the valley to see how we're all trying to comply with Senate Bill 150. And they are looking at mobile home parks as well as a way to accommodate the single-family component of the Senate bill.
Matt?
So, Michael, I would assume that what would happen next is that in the mobile home parks where this is allowed, a lot of the older mobile homes would most likely be replaced by manufactured tiny homes. I'm just, trying to spitball what the effect would be on the mobile home parks here. But I would say that, these tiny homes are less unsightly than a lot of older trailers.
I guess that would be up to the individual owners of those mobile homes and their landlord, or in the case of the mobile home estates, the ability for somebody to purchase a lot with a mobile home and replace it with a tiny home.
Thank you.
I have a question, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you, this is Beth. As an example, within the mobile home parks, if we were to go that route, are there any requirements or limitations related to the lot that the tiny home sits on? For example, the current lot size or the current regulations in any of the zoning, could it be the same lot size just with the tiny home on it? I'm thinking about the mobile park.
Yes, so both with the mobile home estates, mobile home park zoning districts, there are setback requirements and the basically configuration of how those mobile home parks are laid out. And so the tiny home would follow those same setback requirements.
Thank you.
Is the mobile home park down at the lake just federal regulated? We have nothing to do with that?
That's correct, that's outside our jurisdiction.
That would be called a reach. Any other questions? So just kind of building
Yes,
on.
Mr. Chairman. This is
Go
Ernie.
ahead, Mr. Biaski.
Michael, you said early on in your presentation, I think there were three, and I was struggling with picking up on them, but there were three conditions. I think it was from the Senate bill that a small city has to meet. Could you, and I think it was the third item in particular I had trouble with, because I think the first one said it's something about you have to have a zoning district, and then the second one allow a district that has residential use. And then three, was that you can have a tiny home park as a separate item, or could you just clarify that again, please?
Sure. And thank you, Holly, for bringing that back up on the screen. So in the Senate Bill 150, for communities over 150,000 in population, they have to accommodate all three of these different requirements, which is designating one zoning district to accommodate tiny homes as an accessory dwelling unit, designate at least one zoning district to permit them as single-family dwelling units, and create a zoning district that allows for tiny home parks like a mobile home park. Boulder City, because we are under 150,000 in population, only has to do one of the three of these.
One of the three, okay. So it's not just, okay, so it's one of those three is all we have to do.
Correct. Doesn't
Okay.
preclude us from doing all three, it's just we're required to at least do one.
The minimum, okay, I got that. Now, related to the accessory dwelling unit, which is, I think what you said, the tiny homes are to be considered, how does that differ from our current code that talks about accessory structures?
Well,
Will they be different definitions?
yes, because accessory structures are not accessory dwelling units. We have
Okay.
accessory structures, garages, sheds, areas at workshops, but they're not allowed to be permanently occupied. Now, in Boulder City, during the federal era, there were some accessory dwelling units that were grandfathered in. But our code currently prohibits the construction of new accessory dwelling units. So one of the things that Susan does when she's reviewing building permits for new accessory structures is to make sure that they don't include kitchens that would accommodate an accessory dwelling unit to comply with our code.
So, if you have a single, in that definition, of course, I think what we're really talking about is single-family residence, whether it be a tiny home park is in the zoning district or whatever, those then would only allow for one tiny home. Is that am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes, if the path that Boulder City were to take is to say, we will allow tiny homes as a single-family dwelling unit, then it would be the only dwelling unit on that lot, with the exception, of course, in mobile home park examples, you have each mobile home within a certain area defined by the zoning ordinance. But they could all be on the same lot. That makes sense.
Okay. And maybe my last question. I think it was mentioned earlier, but I'm not sure I got a complete answer or if I understood it. When we look at our growth ordinance, how does the tiny home gonna fall under that? I mean, could you maybe elaborate on that? Because I'm not sure I understand that.
Because this would be considered a permanent dwelling unit, permanently occupied, it's staff interpretation that it would have to comply with the growth control ordinance and the maximum number of permits issued per year.
So in other words, if someone came in, let's just say we set up a tiny home park, then that developer would have to get allocations for the number of spots or tiny homes that would be on it or in it?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. So obviously what the real issue is what we're doing is it's a density issue, I guess is what it comes down to. Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So Michael, if we were to proceed with either mobile home estates, allowing them in mobile home estates or mobile home parks, does that satisfy item, is it 2C that satisfies, or is it 2B?
The interpretation would be 2C.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Lassoff mentioned, Nate, you kind of went through kind of a whole thought process, and I didn't quite follow you, so what I'd like to do, and this had to do with, I think your question about setting aside a zone where I think it would be specific to tiny homes rather than within an existing mobile home estate or mobile home park. And maybe I'll address this to Michael first.
Sure.
What was the issue with doing something like that? In other words, if we simply did, in essence, a zoning overlay, got the master plan amended, et cetera, and just said, this area is to be designated for tiny homes exclusively, would that also not satisfy Senate Bill 150?
Well, and that's where we were kind of having the dialogue with Commissioner Lassoff and his questions. We could certainly amend Title 11 and create a new zoning district for tiny homes. But if we don't rezone property to accommodate that,
Right, we'd have to.
and then further, if we don't provide it realistically, it could come into question, are we really responding to the state law? So that's where staff's suggestion is, why not accommodate that within existing zoning districts? And certainly, this wouldn't be our recommendation if we didn't think that those zoning districts were appropriate because they're similar types of uses. But certainly, if it was the recommendation of the Planning Commission to pursue a new zoning district, we could explore that.
Gotcha. Yeah, and now I kind of get a better sense of kind of how that dialogue went. Anyway, it would seem to me that, frankly, here we are, we're faced with having to put something in place within about a year and 3 months, year and 4 months. It seems like this is a case of pick the low-hanging fruit and move forward. If we a future city council or planning commission wanted to expand to a specifically designated area, we could do that as well. But at least going with the mobile home estates, mobile home parks options, we would satisfy the Senate bill in probably the most expeditious manner possible. And then we can move forward as a community and expand upon it if we so choose, it seems.
Yeah, there's something that precludes the city to continue to explore additional options to accommodate tiny homes. It's just with this Senate bill, we have to meet that requirement by January 1 of 2024.
Right, right.
With respect to what Commissioner Biaski said with the controlled growth ordinance, if we permitted it in the mobile home districts, they're not expanding, you know, they would not likely expand, so it really doesn't affect controlled growth because it's just if a mobile home unit went out and was replaced with a tiny home, that's already been allotted for, correct?
That is correct.
So that, there's no growth. And I agree with Chairman Matuska. This is, I think it's a no-brainer. Quite frankly, Henderson, North Las Vegas, and Vegas will have to comply with all three. They're going to have to create a zoning district. So I would be in favor of permitting it in the existing mobile home districts. I think that's the logical choice.
Are there any other questions of staff? Or
Mr. Chairman, Ernie, with respect to the last comment, could a requirement be considered in the code for placing tiny homes within an existing mobile home park, like on a percentage of the number of units in there? Or would it just be, I mean, could you do it that way, perhaps, if, as a constraint, if you wanted it?
I would want to talk to the city attorney about something like that, because if you're allowing it as a permitted use, it's by right, just like any of the other permitted uses within any zoning district. But if you're limiting the number, it kind of calls into question the appropriateness of allowing it in the first place.
Right. And it would
Have we had
seem-
anybody through the permitting process approach the city yet for a tiny home permit?
There have been some general inquiries, but no one has moved forward formally with any applications.
Thanks.
Could, maybe a secondary question, if you, within a, let's say you create a zoning district specific for tiny homes, can you also put a limit on the size of the lots that they would go on?
Yes, just like with all of our single-family residential zoning districts, as well as the mobile home park zoning districts, there are lot or setback requirements to make sure they're appropriately spaced from each other.
So theoretically, you could make, let's say, the requirement larger than just a proportional, let's say a proportionality issue. I mean, so you could theoretically have larger lots and still a lot that would, tiny home might be on, just to keep, let's say, density a little different or a little higher, lower, whatever, I'm saying it wrong. Excuse me.
Well, I think density is controlled now, for example, within the mobile home parks, because it sets minimum setback requirements between the mobile homes. The tiny homes would have to accommodate the same requirements.
Yeah, but that would, I think when I'm thinking, if that's the case, then that just allows more tiny homes to be in there. If because then the setbacks would just allow them closer together, and let's say more of them per than if you just had a mobile home.
I think it's still 1 unit per parcel, right?
Mr.
Yeah.
Chairman, In
ma'am.
both of the mobile home zones, there's a minimum lot size of 6,000 square feet. And state law requires that we can't have different standards for mobile home parks where lots are rented as compared to mobile home subdivisions where lots are owned. So we can't require bigger lots for one zone than the other when they're for mobile homes. Now, if we're going to be amending the code to simply allow tiny homes as basically another allowed use within those zones, that doesn't mean the lot size is going to change. And frankly, we don't have any vacant land zoned for mobile homes. All of the land that we currently have zoned for mobile homes are all developed with mobile home parks, either subdivisions with owned lots or parks where all the lots are rented. And we can't force the owners of the parks to add more lots or anything. So as Member Crum mentioned, what would have to happen in those parks to allow a tiny home as a use would be a person would actually have to remove their mobile home in order to put a tiny home in its place. Because so far the commission doesn't sound like you're looking at allowing these as accessory dwellings. They would just simply be, the code would be amended to allow these in addition to mobile homes as a permitted use, but there still could only be one home on a lot. It's just that the lot size won't change.
Right. Right, yeah, and I think it's pretty clear that, as you say, and as Member Crum and Michael have discussed, we would be simply amending the code to allow these within the mobile home parks and estates. Those parks and estates are privately owned, and we can't force the owners to do something different. So it would seem to me kind of counterproductive if we're trying to get this rolled out in an expeditious manner to layer on additional constraints for the owners of these mobile home parks and estates. And so it would seem prudent to simply allow them as a right, as a use by right, but not put any other constraints on the owner of that facility.
I'm not sure I'm following. Sorry. I think what Susan said is currently we only have several parks within the city that are zoned for mobile home estate or mobile home park. So are we? So right now you could allow tiny homes within at least the mobile home park one, because I think there was a square foot limit on the estates. But are we? So what we're considering, though, is whether we could come up with also a zoning district, which someone could come in and say, hey, I want to, under the land management plan, I want to designate, buy a piece of property, and I want to now create that as a tiny home park. Is that not what would theoretically happen?
That's always an option, but I guess what staff is saying is that probably the easiest way to respond to the obligations of state law is to allow tiny homes as a permitted use within the mobile home park zoning district.
Okay. Okay.
From what I'm hearing, it sounds like the commission tends to feel that that's the prudent first step. I mean, I think we all recognize that the city of Boulder City can proceed and address the other considerations if we so choose. But it sounds like as a first step, let's at least get one or more zones in place, and the mobile home parks seems like the zone that currently would fit them most readily without having to do all that much language drafting and changing. am I reading the commission correctly? I mean, do you guys kind of feel that's the way to move forward?
Yeah,
As
I
a
think
first
they,
step?
have them draft up something that we're, amendment that we can do them in the mobile home park, and then, once they draft it up, I'm sure it's gonna be.
Right, right.
And I'm opposed to any other option other than permitting it in existing mobile home districts.
Well, since you're swinging right to the negative.
It's not negative, I'm just saying that's the one I'm in favor of, the only one I'm in favor of.
Well, I
Yeah,
have to
I can't
admit,
see, like rewriting everything to allow these and casitas, and that
Right.
would open up a whole lot of extra work and things that we put in.
We got the ADU route.
Yeah, we've
right,
things that we've strived to keep our community one way, and then that would open up a whole new, people would be moving around. I know they do it in LA. They like just seriously put them in the backyard, no
That's
setbacks,
right.
no nothing. And then it created a huge traffic issue because now you've doubled all these neighborhoods and car traffic. And so I think what we would, utilizing the mobile home park would be the best way.
With the least amount of impact, negative impact.
right. So, from a staff perspective, is our simple voiced concurrence reasonable, or do you want to see this in the form of a motion?
No, I think we have sufficient guidance, and so we appreciate your feedback.
And I appreciate all the material that you provided to us, as always, and the thoroughness of your presentation, Michael.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, one more thing. I'd be curious if we could possibly do like an advisory question on the next ballot, maybe go to the council and see if the community would want like a tiny home park at some point down the road. I mean, it would require a land sale and all that and a full-on text amendment. See if that was something that the community actually would be interested in. And with it being advisory, it's not obligatory.
Yeah, it's certainly something at the discretion of the council to direct staff to prepare ballot questions in the future.
Well,
Not in favor.
do you have any, does anyone else have anything to add before we wrap this up? Matt?
Yeah, I agree with Nate Lassoff. I think the whole interest in tiny homes is mostly for younger families and for seniors. And we do have a problem in Boulder City that we've had for years where younger families, they get out of high school or college and they have to leave Boulder City because they can't afford to buy a house here. And seniors too, on a fixed income, are having problems affording living in Boulder City. And I think we should keep our options open because these tiny homes could alleviate those problems. And a tiny home park, if it's well-maintained and attractive, I think would be something that might really work for Boulder City. And we should, like I said, keep our options open.
Is that something we can recommend to staff to bring up to city council? Frankly, I would agree with both Matt and Nate that it would be interesting to see kind of what the temperament of the community is with regard to that option as well. Not saying that that needs to be done by 2024, of course, but it certainly would be a path forward to just gauge the interest, and it wouldn't have any harm, certainly.
Well, certainly we will provide the minutes of this meeting to the city council so they will hear your feedback. In terms of a specific motion asking the council to consider a future ballot question, I don't think that's appropriate for this time. And I can certainly talk to the city attorney about how that could be effectuated in the future. But they will have your thoughts and comments, certainly through the minutes.
If that's sufficient, then we'll leave it at that. Any other thoughts or comments from members of the commission? Ernie, Beth?
I'm all set, thank you.
None for me, thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Well, I think that brings this item to a conclusion, which brings us to item number 3, monthly progress report on development allotments.
No comment.
That brings that to a close, which opens up which brings us to the final public comment period. And I think, is it fair to say we could go straight to our virtual audience? And so if anyone in the audience would like to be heard on this, the virtual audience, please call in to 702-589-9629. Thank you, and we'll hold for the delay. Hearing no comments, we'll bring the final public comment period to a close. And with that, we'll close the meeting of September 21st, 2022. Thank you. Thank you. Well, very good. Thank you. I didn't mean to